What if the largest empire the world has ever known left no monuments you were taught to visit, no kings you were told to remember, and no borders on any map printed after a certain year? What if it vanished, not because it never existed, but because someone or something decided it should be forgotten? Tonight we trace lines on very old maps and ask why those lines were erased. So before you let your body sink fully into this comfort, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what we are doing here. And if you would, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, let the story begin. In the autumn of 1929, a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann was working inside the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul. He was cataloguing old Ottoman documents, a quiet, methodical task, the kind that rarely produces surprises. But that afternoon, among the curling parchments and forgotten scrolls, he found something that did not belong to any category he recognized. It was a fragment of a map, painted on gazelle skin, dated to the year 1513. The cartographer's name was written clearly at the edge, Ahmed Muhiddin Piri, an Ottoman admiral and navigator known to history as Piri Reis. The map depicted the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and, most disturbingly, what appeared to be the northern coastline of Antarctica. This was more than 3 centuries before Antarctica was officially discovered in 1820. The landmass was drawn not as a guess, not as a mythological flourish, but with contours that suggested someone, at some point, had seen what lay beneath the ice. The discovery was noted. It was studied. In 1956, a cartographer at the United States Navy Hydrographic Office named Arlington Mallory examined the Piri Reis map alongside modern seismic surveys of the Antarctic coast. His conclusion was unsettling. The coastline on the old map corresponded in remarkable detail to the actual subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, the shape of the continent as it would appear if the ice were removed. Charles Hapgood, a professor of history at Keene State College in New Hampshire, later expanded on Mallory's work. He brought the map to the attention of the United States Air Force, and in 1960, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer of the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron wrote a letter confirming that the lower portion of the map did indeed appear to depict the Princess Martha coast of Antarctica, free of ice. Ohlmeyer noted that this level of geographic knowledge was not available during the 16th century by any known means. The question that followed was quiet but heavy. If Piri Reis copied from older source maps, and the Admiral himself noted this in the margins, then who made those source maps? And when? This question might have remained an isolated curiosity, a footnote in the history of cartography, if not for a much larger silence that surrounds it. Because the Piri Reis map is not the only old document that seems to know more than it should, and it is not the only artifact connected to a name that has, over the past 2 centuries, been slowly and methodically removed from the record of human memory. That name is Tartaria. Open any European atlas printed between the 16th and 18th centuries, and you will find it. Grand Tartary, Tartaria Magna, the Great Tartarian Empire, a territory spanning from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, from the frozen shores of Siberia to the borders of Persia and China. On the 1570 world map of Abraham Ortelius, the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, considered the first modern atlas, Tartaria occupies more landmass than any other labelled region on Earth. It is not drawn as a wilderness. It is not marked as unexplored. It is named. It is bordered. It is presented as a known political and geographical entity, as real as the Ottoman Empire or the Kingdom of France. And yet, by the mid-19th century, it had vanished from nearly every map, every schoolbook, every historical reference that shaped the modern understanding of the world. This disappearance was not sudden. It didn't happen with a single decree or a single war. It happened gradually, one edition at a time, one revised atlas at a time, until the word itself became strange. Say Tartaria today, and most educated people will pause, uncertain. Some will associate it vaguely with the Mongol Empire. Others will think of Tartars, an ethnic designation that European writers once applied broadly and imprecisely to the peoples of Central and Northern Asia. But very few will recognise it as the name of the largest contiguous territory ever labelled on a European map. Fewer still will ask why it was removed, and perhaps that is the most interesting part of this story. Not the empire itself, but the forgetting. Because forgetting on this scale is never accidental. Languages do not lose words without reason. Cartographers do not erase continents by mistake. When an entire civilization disappears from the collective record, something has happened. Something deliberate, or something catastrophic, or perhaps both. And the deeper one looks into the maps, the texts, and the silences that surround this disappearing name, the more one begins to notice that Tartaria is not the only thing that has been quietly removed from the story of the world. There is another place, vast, ancient, and locked beneath miles of ice at the bottom of the earth, where similar silences gather and similar questions remain unanswered. A continent that no one is allowed to freely explore. A landmass older than any civilization we have been taught to remember. And the maps, those old maps drawn on gazelle skin and vellum, seem to whisper that someone once knew what was there, before the ice, before the silence, before the forgetting began. What connected Tartaria to Antarctica? Why did both disappear from the conversation at roughly the same time in history? And who benefits from a world that does not remember? The name did not appear quietly. It was not scribbled in the margins of a single obscure document or whispered by a single forgotten traveller. It was printed in bold letters across the largest landmass on Earth, repeated by the most respected cartographers of the European Renaissance, and accepted without controversy for more than 200 years. Grand Tartary, Tartaria Magna, Grand Tartary. The words changed with the language, but the territory they described remained remarkably consistent. A sweep of land so vast that it dwarfed the empires Europeans already knew, and yet for all its size, for all the ink spent labelling it, this territory has become one of the most thoroughly ignored subjects in modern historical education. To understand how something so enormous could be so completely forgotten, one must first understand how clearly it was once remembered. In 1570, Abraham Ortelius published the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum in Antwerp. It is widely regarded as the first true modern atlas, a systematic collection of uniform maps bound together with descriptive text, intended to represent the known world as Europeans understood it. Ortelius was not a speculator or a mystic. He was a geographer and cartographer of the highest reputation, a friend of Gerardus Mercator, and a man whose work was purchased by kings, scholars, and navigators across the continent. On his map of Asia, the word Tartaria stretches across a region that begins roughly at the Volga River and extends eastward beyond the Sea of Japan, northward into the Arctic, and southward toward the Himalayas and the Great Wall of China. The territory is not blank. Rivers are drawn, mountain ranges are sketched, cities and settlements are marked with small symbols, suggesting that whoever provided the source information had either travelled through this land or spoken to those who had. Ortelius did not treat Tartaria as a mystery. He treated it as a fact. 25 years later, Gerardus Mercator, perhaps the most influential cartographer in Western history, the man whose projection still shapes the way most people visualize the globe, published his own atlas posthumously. His son Rumold oversaw the final edition. In it, Tartaria appears again, vast and labelled, occupying the same enormous territory. Mercator's maps were more refined, more detailed, and more widely distributed than those of any cartographer before him. His 1595 Arctic map, one of the most studied documents in the history of cartography, shows the North Pole surrounded by 4 land masses, separated by rivers flowing inward toward a central whirlpool. A geography that does not correspond to any modern understanding, and yet was drawn with the precision and confidence of a man who believed he was recording reality. In the surrounding regions, the territories of Tartaria are clearly indicated. Mercator did not question whether Tartaria existed, he measured it. The pattern continued through the 17th and 18th centuries. Guillaume de Lisle, often called the father of French cartography, produced a 1706 map titled Carte de Tartarie, in which the region is divided into distinct sub-territories: Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. Each is drawn with borders, settlements, and geographic features. The distinction is important. De Lisle was not simply labelling a vague wilderness. He was identifying political and cultural divisions within a recognised territory in the same way that a modern mapmaker might divide Europe into its constituent nations. His contemporary, the cartographer Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville, produced similarly detailed maps of the region throughout the 1730s and 1740s, and the Encyclopédie of Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, the monumental work of the French Enlightenment, published between 1751 and 1772, contained entries describing Tartary as a real and extensive territory, noting its peoples, its geography, and its political structures. These were not fringe sources. These were the most authoritative references of their era, and then, slowly, the name began to fade. By the early 19th century, European maps increasingly replaced Tartaria with Russian Empire or Siberia or Central Asia. The vast named territory fractured into pieces, each piece absorbed into the expanding borders of neighbouring empires, Russia from the west, China from the south. The word itself became archaic. Textbooks stopped using it. New atlases omitted it. Within the span of roughly 100 years, a name that had dominated European geography for over 2 centuries became, for all practical purposes, extinct. The land did not vanish. The mountains and rivers and steppes remained exactly where they had always been. But the identity, the political, cultural and historical identity that the name Tartaria once signified, was dissolved, as if by acid, into the identities of the empires that claimed its soil. How does one explain such a disappearance? There are, of course, conventional answers. Historians will point out that European knowledge of Central and Northern Asia was always imperfect, that the label Tartaria was applied loosely by Western mapmakers who conflated the Mongol Empire, the Turkic Khanates, and various nomadic confederations under a single, imprecise term borrowed from Tatar, an ethnonym used by Turkic and Mongol peoples. In this reading, Tartaria was never a unified empire at all. It was a cartographic convenience, a placeholder for regions that Europeans did not fully understand. And when those regions were eventually colonized, mapped in greater detail, and absorbed by Russia and China, the placeholder was no longer needed. Ooh, this explanation is tidy, it is rational, and it may well be partly true, but it does not account for everything. It does not explain why cartographers as meticulous as Mercator and de Lisle drew borders and cities within Tartaria, features that suggest more than mere guesswork. It does not explain why the Encyclopédie described its peoples and customs with the specificity of direct observation, and it does not explain the speed and thoroughness of the erasure, the way the name disappeared not just from maps but from cultural memory itself, as though a deliberate effort had been made to ensure that no one would think to look for what had been removed. There is a pattern in history that repeats with uncomfortable regularity. When one civilization conquers another, the first thing it destroys is not the buildings or the people. It is the story, the narrative, the name. Because a people without a name cannot claim a past, and a people without a past cannot challenge the present. The Romans understood this. The Spanish understood this in the Americas. The British understood this across their empire. And the question that lingers, like smoke after a fire, is whether the same pattern applied to the land once called Tartaria, and whether the silence that surrounds it today is not the absence of evidence, but the evidence of absence. Because if something was deliberately erased, the tools used to erase it would themselves need to be hidden. And the place where such tools might be hidden, the place where evidence might be locked away from every prying eye, would need to be the most inaccessible location on Earth. A place surrounded by ice, guarded by treaties and closed to every nation's citizens equally. A place very much like the bottom of the world. The burning did not happen once, it happened again and again, across centuries and continents, in places that shared no language, no religion, no common ruler, and yet carried out the same act with the same terrible precision. The destruction of knowledge is not a footnote in human history, it is one of its most persistent themes, and if one is willing to look at this pattern honestly, without flinching, a disturbing possibility begins to take shape. That the disappearance of Tartaria from the historical record is not an anomaly, but merely the most recent chapter in a story as old as civilization itself, a story in which the victors do not simply win, they rewrite. The Library of Alexandria is perhaps the most famous wound in the memory of the human species. Founded in the 3rd century BCE under Ptolemy I Soter, it was conceived not merely as a repository of scrolls, but as the intellectual centre of the ancient world, a place where the accumulated knowledge of Egypt, Greece, Persia, India and Babylon could be gathered, translated, cross-referenced and preserved. At its height, the library is believed to have held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, encompassing mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, navigation, history, and subjects for which modern scholars have no surviving names. The destruction of this library, whether by Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, the decree of Theophilus in 391 CE, or the gradual erosion of centuries, remains one of the greatest intellectual losses in recorded history. What was in those scrolls? What did the ancient world know that the modern world has had to rediscover, or has never recovered at all? The answers are buried, not in sand, but in silence. And Alexandria was not alone. In 213 BCE, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, ordered the burning of books and the execution of scholars in what became known as the Fenshu Kengru, the burning of texts and burying of Confucian scholars alive. The stated purpose was to consolidate political power by eliminating competing philosophies and historical narratives that might challenge the legitimacy of the Qin dynasty. Medical texts, agricultural manuals and certain divinatory works were spared, but histories, philosophical treatises and poetry, the kinds of documents that carry cultural identity, were systematically destroyed. Sima Qian, the great Han Dynasty historian, recorded these events in the Shiji, and the weight of his account has echoed through Chinese scholarship for more than 2,000 years. What Qin Shi Huang understood, with ruthless clarity, was that controlling the past is the most efficient way to control the future. If no one remembers what came before you, no one can argue that what came before you was better. This same logic appeared in the Americas centuries later, wearing a different face but carrying the same intent. When Spanish conquistadors and Catholic missionaries arrived in Mesoamerica in the 16th century, they encountered civilizations of extraordinary sophistication, the Maya, the Aztec, the Mixtec, peoples who had developed complex writing systems, astronomical calendars of remarkable accuracy, mathematical concepts including the independent invention of zero and architectural achievements that still challenge modern engineering analysis. The Maya alone had produced thousands of bark paper codices, folding books that recorded history, astronomy, ritual, genealogy and prophecy. Of these thousands, exactly 4 survive today. 4. The rest were burned, most notably in the auto da fe of July 1562, when Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the destruction of Maya books and religious images at Mani in the Yucatan. De Landa himself later wrote, with no apparent irony, that the Maya used certain characters or letters with which they wrote in their books about the antiquities and their sciences. He recorded a partial alphabet, the so-called De Landa alphabet, which took scholars centuries to decode. He preserved just enough to prove that what he had burned was real, and the knowledge itself, the astronomy, the history, The accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had been keeping records for more than 1,000 years was reduced to ash and scattered by wind. What emerges from these episodes is not a series of isolated tragedies, it is a method. When the Romans absorbed Egypt, the intellectual heritage of Alexandria was gradually dismantled. When the Qin dynasty unified China, the philosophical diversity of the Warring States period was crushed into conformity. When the Spanish claimed the Americas, the written memory of entire civilizations was incinerated in public squares, and in each case, the destruction was followed by replacement. New narratives, new histories, new origin stories that positioned the conqueror as the beginning of meaning, and everything before as savagery or silence. The pattern is not subtle, it is not hidden. It is simply so large and so frequently repeated that most people accept it as the natural order of things, the way one accepts weather or gravity. As though the erasure of the past is simply what happens when power changes hands, rather than a deliberate strategy designed to prevent the conquered from ever remembering who they were. Now apply this pattern to Tartaria. Here was a territory vast enough to be labelled on every major European atlas for more than 200 years. Here was a name recognised by the finest cartographers, the most rigorous encyclopedists, the most educated minds of the European Enlightenment. And here was an erasure so complete that the very mention of the name today provokes confusion or dismissal. The conventional explanation that Tartaria was merely a vague European label for Central Asia, and that it disappeared naturally as geographic knowledge improved, is not unreasonable. But it asks the observer to believe that 2 centuries of consistent cartographic tradition simply evaporated through the benign process of better mapping. It asks the observer to ignore the possibility that the expansion of the Russian Empire eastward and the Qing dynasty westward, the 2 great powers that absorbed the territories once labelled Tartaria, might have had reasons to erase the name, the identity and the memory of whatever existed in those lands before they claimed them. Peter the Great modernised Russia's cartographic institutions in the early 18th century. Catherine the Great sponsored extensive geographic surveys of Siberia and Central Asia. The Qing dynasty, under the Kangxi and Qianlong emperors, produced the Jesuit-assisted Kangxi Atlas and the comprehensive Qianlong maps, which redrew the interior of Asia according to imperial priorities. In both cases, the label Tartaria was systematically removed and replaced with designations that reflected the sovereignty of the conquering power. The land did not change, the rivers still flowed, the mountains still stood, but the name, the identity, was dissolved like salt in water, until no trace of it remained on the surface, and once a name is gone, the questions it might have prompted go with it. Questions about who lived there, what they built, what they knew, and whether any of that knowledge, any of those records, any of those maps, might have described places and histories that the new rulers preferred to keep buried. Places perhaps as distant and as silent as the frozen continent at the bottom of the world. There is a continent at the bottom of the earth that no civilization in recorded history claims to have built upon, no ancient text explicitly names, and no modern nation is permitted to own. It covers 14 million square kilometres, larger than Europe, larger than Australia, and it is buried beneath an ice sheet that, in places, reaches more than 4 kilometres thick. The average temperature in its interior drops below -50 degrees Celsius. Winds scour its surface at speeds that would shatter windows. No indigenous human population has ever been documented there. And yet old maps drawn centuries before any known expedition reached its shores, appear to depict its coastline with a precision that should be impossible. The question is not simply how those maps were made. The question is what their existence implies about the history of the world, and whether the ice that covers Antarctica is not a permanent feature of the planet, but a recent one, laid down over a landscape that was once very different from the frozen wasteland we see today. In 1958, Charles Hapgood published a book titled Earth's Crust Displacement, Hapgood was not a geologist. He was a professor of history at Keene State College in New Hampshire, an unlikely figure to challenge the foundations of geological orthodoxy. But his hypothesis, built over years of careful study, proposed something radical. He suggested that the outer shell of the Earth, the lithosphere, could, under certain conditions, shift as a single unit for the underlying layers, moving entire continents to new latitudinal positions without the slow, grinding process of plate tectonics. This was not continental drift in the traditional sense. It was something faster, more dramatic, a displacement of the entire crust, potentially triggered by the asymmetric buildup of polar ice or by gravitational forces acting on the uneven distribution of mass across the Earth's surface. Under this model, a landmass that once sat in temperate or even subtropical latitudes could, within a geologically brief period, be relocated to the pole and buried beneath a growing ice cap. The idea was controversial. It still is. But what made Hapgood's work remarkable was not only the hypothesis itself, it was the man who endorsed it. In 1953, 5 years before the book's publication, Albert Einstein wrote a foreword to an earlier version of Hapgood's work titled The Earth's Shifting Crust. Einstein, then in the final years of his life, stated that Hapgood's argument was of great importance to everything that is related to the history of the Earth's surface. He noted that the idea deserved serious consideration and that the evidence Hapgood had assembled was substantial enough to warrant further investigation by the scientific community. Einstein did not claim that the theory was proven, but the fact that the most celebrated physicist of the 20th century found the hypothesis credible enough to publicly support it suggests that dismissing it outright would be, at the very least, premature, and the implications of the theory, if even partially correct, are staggering, because they would mean that Antarctica as it exists today, encased in ice and stripped of all visible history, may not have always been where it is now. It may have drifted there, and what lies beneath the ice may be the remains of a world that existed before the shift, a world that someone long ago remembered well enough to draw on a map. The Piri Reis map of 1513 was only the beginning. In 1531, the French mathematician and cartographer Orontius Finaeus produced a world map that depicted Antarctica as a distinct continent, separated from South America, with detailed coastal features, inland waterways, and mountain ranges. The map was drawn nearly 3 centuries before the first confirmed sighting of the Antarctic mainland by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen in 1820. Phineas labelled the southern landmass Terra Australis, and while some historians have argued that this was simply a reflection of the classical belief in a hypothetical southern continent, a theoretical counterweight to the northern landmasses, the level of detail on the map exceeds what a theoretical concept would require. Coastlines curve in specific ways, inlets are marked, mountain ranges run in directions that, when compared to modern subglacial surveys, show patterns that are more than coincidental. Then there is the Map of Philippe Boissche, published in 1737. Boissche was the royal geographer of France, a man of impeccable scholarly credentials and a member of the Académie Royale des Sciences. His map of the southern hemisphere depicted Antarctica not as a single landmass, but as 2 separate islands divided by a waterway, a configuration that corresponds with startling accuracy to the subglacial topography revealed by modern radar and seismic surveys. Beneath the ice, Antarctica is indeed divided into 2 major landmasses, East Antarctica and West Antarctica, separated by a deep rift that would be a sea passage if the ice were removed. Boissche could not have known this through any technology available in the 18th century. Conventional radar sounding of Antarctic bedrock did not begin until the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958, more than 200 years after Boissche drew his map. So how did he know? Where did his information come from? Hapgood spent years investigating this question. In his 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, he argued that the Piri Reis map The Phineas map, the Boitier map, and several other anomalous cartographic documents were not the products of their credited authors alone. Instead, he proposed that they were copies, or compilations, of much older source maps, originating from an unknown civilization that possessed advanced navigational and geographic knowledge long before the rise of Greece, Rome, or any society recognized by conventional history. Hapgood did not speculate wildly about who this civilization might have been. He simply followed the evidence, the precision of the coastlines, the projection methods used, the spherical trigonometry implied by the map constructions, and concluded that someone, at some point in the deep past, had surveyed the Earth with a sophistication that the modern world did not achieve until the 18th or 19th century. The academic response to Hapgood's work has been mixed. Many geologists reject the crustal displacement hypothesis outright, arguing that the forces required to shift the entire lithosphere in the manner Hapgood described are insufficient under known physical laws. Some cartographic historians have challenged his readings of the old maps, suggesting that the resemblances to Antarctic coastlines are coincidental or the result of creative interpretation. But others have acknowledged that the maps remain genuinely puzzling, that they contain features which cannot be easily explained by the state of geographic knowledge at the time they were drawn. And the question Hapgood raised has never been fully answered. If Antarctica was ice-free within the span of human existence, if it once sat in a temperate zone, with rivers and forests and coastlines that could be seen and charted, then what was there? Who lived on it? What did they build? And when the ice came, slowly or suddenly, what happened to everything they knew? The maps remember something. The ice holds something. And the silence that surrounds both is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of a door that has been deliberately closed 4 kilometers beneath the surface of the East Antarctic ice sheet. In a darkness that has not been touched by sunlight for millions of years, there is a lake. It is not small. It stretches roughly 250 kilometers in length and 50 kilometers in width, covering an area comparable to Lake Ontario. Its waters are liquid, kept from freezing by the insulating pressure of the ice above, and, possibly, by geothermal heat rising from the Earth's interior below. It has been sealed from the atmosphere for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. No wind has rippled its surface. No rain has fallen into it. No living thing, as far as the modern world knows, has looked upon it since before the genus Homo existed. Its name is Lake Vostok, and it was discovered, or rather confirmed, in 1996 through a combination of airborne radar sounding and satellite altimetry data. The Russian research station Vostok sits directly above it, planted on the ice in 1957 during the International Geophysical Year. For decades, the scientists stationed there did not know what lay beneath their feet, and when they finally learned, the discovery raised questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. The existence of subglacial lakes in Antarctica had been theorized since the 1960s, when British and Soviet airborne radar surveys detected anomalous reflections beneath the ice, flat mirror-like surfaces that behaved differently from the surrounding bedrock. By the early 2000s, more than 400 subglacial lakes had been identified across the continent, forming a hidden hydrological network beneath the ice sheet. Rivers and reservoirs flowing in total darkness, connecting basins that no human eye has ever seen. Lake Vostok is the largest of these, but it is far from the only one. The implications are difficult to overstate. Beneath the ice of Antarctica, there exists an entire aquatic system, a world of liquid water, mineral deposits, and potentially biological activity that has been isolated from the rest of the planet for a span of time so vast that it predates the emergence of every human civilization, every human species, and most of the mammalian lineages that populate the Earth today. In 2012, after more than 2 decades of drilling, a Russian team penetrated the ice sheet and reached the surface of Lake Vostok for the first time. The borehole extended 3,769 meters, nearly 4 kilometers of ice. compressed and layered, each stratum a frozen record of atmospheric conditions stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. The drilling was conducted under extraordinary precautions. Scientists feared that breaching the lake could contaminate one of the last pristine environments on Earth, or, more quietly discussed, that the lake itself might contain something unexpected. When the drill tip finally touched water, the pressurized lake surged upward into the borehole, freezing as it rose. Samples of this refrozen water were extracted and analyzed. The results, published over the following years by Russian and international research teams, revealed traces of microbial DNA, suggesting that life of some kind may persist in the lake despite the extreme conditions. Some of the genetic sequences did not match any known organisms in existing databases. The findings were contested. Some researchers argued that the DNA traces were contaminants from the drilling fluid. Others maintained that the sequences were genuine and that Lake Vostok harbours a biosphere unlike anything on the surface of the planet. The debate remains unresolved, but it is the ice cores themselves, the long cylinders of frozen time extracted from the borehole, that tell perhaps the more profound story. Ice core analysis is one of the most powerful tools in paleoclimatology. Each layer of ice preserves a record of the atmosphere at the time it was deposited. Trapped air bubbles contain ancient concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and oxygen isotopes that reveal temperature, precipitation, volcanic activity, and even the presence of cosmic dust. The Vostok ice core, drilled over several campaigns beginning in the 1970s, provided the first continuous climate record spanning 420,000 years, later extended to more than 800,000 years by the European EPICA project at Dome C. These records revealed a pattern of glacial and interglacial cycles, long periods of cold punctuated by shorter warm intervals, driven by variations in the Earth's orbit known as Milankovitch cycles. The data is elegant, meticulous, and deeply informative, but it also contains an implication that is rarely spoken aloud in popular accounts of the science. If Antarctica's ice sheet has grown and retreated in response to orbital cycles, then there have been periods, long periods, during which significant portions of the continent were free of ice, or covered by ice thin enough to allow a very different landscape to emerge, and the geological record confirms this. Fossil evidence collected from exposed rock formations along the Transantarctic Mountains and the Antarctic Peninsula tells of a continent that was once warm, green, and alive. Fossilized leaves of Nothofagus, southern beech trees, have been found in Eocene age deposits, dating to roughly 34 to 56 million years ago. Petrified wood, fern impressions, and the remains of freshwater mollusks point to forests, rivers, and temperate ecosystems that once covered regions now buried under kilometres of ice. In 2017, researchers aboard the JOIDES Resolution drilling vessel recovered sediment cores from the seafloor near West Antarctica that contained fossilized pollen, spores, and root traces from a swampy rainforest that existed approximately 90 million years ago, during the mid-Cretaceous period. The discovery, published in the journal Nature, suggested that Antarctica's interior was far warmer and far more biologically productive than previously understood, even during a period when the continent was already positioned near the South Pole. The planet's climate, in other words, was capable of sustaining lush vegetation at polar latitudes, provided that atmospheric conditions, particularly carbon dioxide levels, were sufficiently elevated. 90 million years is a long time, far too long for any human civilization to have witnessed those Cretaceous forests. But the Eocene warm period, ending roughly 34 million years ago, and the subsequent fluctuations of ice coverage bring the timeline closer, and the Pliocene warm period, approximately 3 to 5 million years ago, saw Antarctic temperatures several degrees higher than today, with evidence suggesting significant ice sheet reduction. Some models indicate that portions of East Antarctica may have lost substantial ice coverage during this interval. 3 million years is still well before the emergence of anatomically modern humans, who appeared roughly 300,000 years ago. But it's not before the emergence of the genus Homo, whose earliest members, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, walked the Earth during the late Pliocene and early Pleistocene, and if Hapgood's crustal displacement theory holds any validity, if the continent's position shifted more recently than the standard geological model allows, then the window narrows further, and the possibility that a warm or partially ice-free Antarctica overlapped with the existence of cognitively capable humans becomes less a fantasy and more an open question. The ice remembers what the world has forgotten. Each layer is a page, each trapped bubble a word, each isotopic ratio a sentence written in a language that only patience can decode. And beneath all of it, beneath the compressed memory of 800,000 years of atmosphere, there is water. Dark water, pressurized and ancient, sealed away from the sky since before the first stone tool was struck. What else is sealed with it? What structures, what sediments, what traces of presence might lie on the bedrock beneath Lake Vostok, or beneath any of the 400 other hidden lakes scattered across the continent? The drilling stopped at the water's surface. The questions did not. In the southern summer of 1946, the United States Navy organized the largest expedition ever sent to Antarctica. It was called Operation Highjump, and its official designation was the United States Navy Antarctic Development Program. The task force was commanded by Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd, a man who had already become a national hero for his polar explorations. His 1926 flight over the North Pole, his 1929 flight over the South Pole, and his harrowing solo winter at Advance Base in 1934, where he nearly died of carbon monoxide poisoning while maintaining a weather station alone in the Antarctic darkness. Byrd was not a fringe figure. He was one of the most decorated officers in the history of the United States Navy, a recipient of the Medal of Honor, and a man whose name carried the weight of institutional authority. When he was given command of Operation Highjump, it was understood that this was not a casual undertaking. The expedition departed from Norfolk, Virginia, in December 1946, and what followed has generated more questions than any official report has ever answered. The scale of the operation was, by any measure, extraordinary. Task Force 68 consisted of 4,700 men, 13 ships, including the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, an icebreaker, destroyers, tankers, and cargo vessels, 25 aircraft, and enough equipment and supplies to sustain operations for 8 months. The stated objectives were straightforward: to train personnel for cold weather operations, to extend American sovereignty claims over portions of Antarctica, to test military equipment in extreme conditions, and to conduct aerial photographic surveys of the coastline and interior. These were reasonable goals, and they aligned with the strategic anxieties of the early Cold War. The Soviet Union was also expanding its Antarctic presence, and the geopolitical value of the continent, though poorly defined, was taken seriously by both superpowers. On the surface, everything about Operation Highjump was explainable, but the surface, in Antarctica as in history, is not always where the truth resides. The expedition was originally planned to last 6 to 8 months. It was terminated after approximately 8 weeks. The official explanation for the early withdrawal cited the onset of the Antarctic winter and the increasingly dangerous ice conditions that threatened the fleet. This is plausible. Antarctic sea ice is genuinely lethal to vessels caught in its grip, and the southern winter closes in with merciless speed. But the abruptness of the departure surprised observers at the time, and the post-operation reports were notably thin on detail for a mission of such unprecedented scale. Several aircraft were lost during the operation, at least 3 men died, and the photographic survey, while productive, approximately 70,000 aerial photographs were taken, covered only a fraction of the territory that the original plan had envisioned. Something had interrupted the mission. Whether that something was ice, logistics, politics, or something else entirely has been debated ever since. It is what Byrd said afterward that has drawn the most persistent attention. In March 1947, following the conclusion of Operation Highjump, Bird gave an interview to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio. The interview has been cited, quoted, paraphrased and disputed for decades, and its exact wording has been the subject of considerable controversy, not least because the original article was published in Spanish and subsequent English translations have varied. But the substance of Bird's reported remarks was striking. He was quoted as warning that the United States should prepare for the possibility of hostile aircraft coming from the polar regions, and that in the event of a new war, the continental United States could be attacked by objects capable of flying from pole to pole at tremendous speed. The language was vague enough to support multiple interpretations, but specific enough to alarm those who read it carefully. Bird was not a man given to public hysteria. He was a military officer of the highest rank and reputation. For him to speak in such terms, however obliquely, suggested that he had encountered something during Operation Highjump that the official reports did not describe. The El Mercurio interview has become one of the most contested documents in the unofficial history of Antarctic exploration. Skeptics argue that Bird's remarks were taken out of context, mistranslated, or referred simply to the emerging threat of Soviet long-range aviation, a legitimate strategic concern in 1947, the same year that the Cold War began in earnest. This interpretation is reasonable, and it may well be correct, but it does not account for the other silences that surround the expedition. It does not explain why, in the years following Operation Highjump, Bird's public statements about Antarctica became increasingly guarded, increasingly cryptic, and increasingly tinged with a sense of urgency that went beyond the usual rhetoric of Cold War preparedness. In 1955, Bird was placed in command of Operation Deep Freeze, the logistics arm of the American contribution to the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958. He returned to Antarctica for the last time. He died in 1957, at the age of 68, and whatever he knew, whatever he had seen or been told, went with him into a silence that has never been broken by any official source. There are those who have attempted to fill that silence with speculation. The most dramatic claims, involving hidden bases, advanced technology, and encounters with unknown forces beneath the ice, belong to a genre of alternative history that trades in sensationalism and resists verification. These claims are easy to dismiss, and many of them deserve to be dismissed. But dismissing the speculation does not answer the underlying questions. Why was the largest military expedition in Antarctic history cut short? Why were the official reports so sparse? Why did Bird speak, even once, in language that suggested he had encountered something he could not fully explain? And why, in the decades that followed, did the world's most powerful nations agree to lock Antarctica behind a treaty that restricted access, prohibited military activity, and ensured that no single country and no private citizen could freely explore the continent's interior? The timing alone deserves examination. Operation Highjump concluded in early 1947. The Soviet Union conducted its own Antarctic expeditions throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. The International Geophysical Year, spanning 1957 to 1958, brought 12 nations to Antarctica for coordinated scientific research, an unprecedented act of international cooperation during the most dangerous period of the Cold War. And in 1959, those 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty, which remains in force to this day. The treaty declared Antarctica a demilitarized zone, reserved exclusively for peaceful scientific research. It prohibited nuclear explosions, banned military maneuvers, and established a framework for international inspection and cooperation. On its face, it was a triumph of diplomacy, a rare moment when rival powers chose science over sovereignty. But beneath the surface, the treaty also accomplished something else. It ensured that no independent nation, no private enterprise, and no unaffiliated individual could claim, settle, or freely explore any portion of the continent. Antarctica became, in legal terms, the most restricted landmass on Earth, a place where access is controlled, movements are monitored, and the interior remains, for all practical purposes, off-limits to anyone without institutional authorization. The conventional explanation for this is straightforward. Antarctica's environment is so extreme, so hostile to human life, that unrestricted access would lead to death, pollution, and the destruction of irreplaceable scientific resources. The ice cores, the atmospheric data, the pristine ecosystems, all would be threatened by commercial exploitation or careless tourism. This reasoning is sound. It is also, by a remarkable coincidence, identical to the reasoning one would use if the true purpose were not to protect the environment, but to protect a secret. Because the structure of the Antarctic Treaty, the international consensus, the prohibition on sovereignty, the restriction of access, is indistinguishable in practical effect from a quarantine, and a quarantine raises an inevitable question. What exactly is being quarantined? What lies beneath the ice that is so important, also dangerous, that every major nation on Earth has agreed for more than 60 years to leave it untouched? Richard Byrd flew over the pole. He commanded thousands of men and dozens of ships. He saw things that no official document describes. And then he came home, and he spoke in riddles, and he died. The ice remained, the treaty was signed, and the questions, the old, heavy, unanswerable questions, settled into the same frozen silence that covers everything at the bottom of the world. But silence, as the old maps remind us, is not the same as absence. Sometimes silence is the loudest sound in the room. Sometimes it is the sound of something being kept. In the winter of 1959, 12 nations sat down at a table in Washington, D.C., and agreed on something that, by the logic of the era, should have been impossible. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a nuclear standoff that had brought the world to the edge of annihilation. Britain and France were struggling to maintain the remnants of their colonial empires. Argentina and Chile were pressing overlapping territorial claims on the Antarctic Peninsula with a ferocity that bordered on military confrontation. And yet, despite these rivalries, despite the suspicion, the espionage, the arms races, and the ideological hatred that defined the Cold War, all 12 nations agreed to set aside their claims, their ambitions, and their strategic interests, and to declare an entire continent off-limits to sovereignty, military activity, and commercial exploitation. The document they signed was the Antarctic Treaty. It entered into force on June 23, 1961, and in the more than 6 decades since, it has never been seriously violated, renegotiated, or challenged by any signatory. In a world where nations have gone to war over islands the size of parking lots, this unanimity is, at the very least, unusual. At most, it is inexplicable. Unless one considers the possibility that what unites these nations in their agreement is not idealism, but a shared knowledge of something that none of them wishes to reveal. The treaty itself is a study in careful language. Its 14 articles establish a framework that is simultaneously open and restrictive, permitting scientific research while prohibiting virtually everything else. Article 1 declares that Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. Article 5 prohibits nuclear explosions and the disposal of radioactive waste. Article 7 provides for a system of mutual inspection, allowing any signatory to observe the stations and activities of any other. And Article 4, perhaps the most significant clause, freezes all territorial claims without resolving them. No nation is required to abandon its claim, but no nation may enforce it. The effect is a kind of permanent legal limbo, in which the continent belongs to everyone and no one simultaneously. This arrangement has been praised by diplomats and legal scholars as a model of international cooperation, but it also means that no single nation has the authority to grant or deny access to any part of the continent independently. Decisions are made collectively, by consensus, behind closed doors, and the interior of Antarctica, the vast, ice-covered heartland that constitutes more than 95% of the continent's surface area, remains in practice beyond the reach of any unaffiliated investigation. The nations that signed the original treaty in 1959 were the 12 that had been active in Antarctica during the International Geophysical Year: Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Since then, the number of signatories has grown to more than 50. The Protocol on Environmental Protection, adopted in Madrid in 1991, and commonly known as the Madrid Protocol, added further restrictions, banning all mineral resource activities, establishing Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science, and requiring environmental impact assessments for virtually any human activity on the continent. The Madrid Protocol is set to remain in force until 2048, at which point it may be reviewed. But any modification requires the agreement of all consultative parties, making meaningful change virtually impossible without unanimous consent. The structure, in other words, is designed not merely to protect Antarctica, but to ensure that the current arrangement, the restriction, the monitoring, the collective control, endures indefinitely. Consider what this means in practical terms. If a private researcher, an independent university, or a small nation wish to conduct an unsupervised geological survey of a specific region of interior Antarctica, to drill through the ice in a location of their choosing, to examine the bedrock, to catalogue whatever structures or formations might lie beneath, they would find it essentially impossible to do so. The logistics alone would be prohibitive, requiring icebreakers, aircraft, fuel depots, and survival infrastructure that only major governments or heavily funded institutions can provide. But even if the logistics were solved, the legal framework would intervene. Any activity in Antarctica must be reported, inspected, and approved within the treaty system. There is no provision for independent exploration. There is no right of access for private citizens. The continent is, in the most literal sense, a closed zone, open to science, but only to science that operates within the parameters established by the treaty's consultative parties. And those parameters, by design, are set by the same governments that have maintained control over Antarctic research since the 1950s. This arrangement might be entirely benign. It might be exactly what it appears to be: a far-sighted agreement to protect a fragile environment from the destructive tendencies of human greed and geopolitical competition. The ice cores, the atmospheric records, the microbial ecosystems, the ozone monitoring stations. All of these are genuine scientific treasures, and all of them benefit from the stability and protection that the treaty provides. But there is a dissonance that is difficult to ignore. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union could not agree on arms control, human rights, Berlin, Cuba, Korea, Vietnam, or the basic structure of the international order. They competed viciously in space, in technology, in espionage, and in proxy wars that killed millions. And yet, when it came to Antarctica, they agreed, completely, immediately, and permanently. What could possibly have motivated such cooperation? What shared interest could have been powerful enough to override the deepest ideological and strategic rivalries of the 20th century? One answer is simple pragmatism. Antarctica in the 1950s had no obvious economic value. Its mineral resources were inaccessible. Its strategic significance was uncertain. Neither superpower had the ability to establish a permanent self-sustaining military presence there, and the cost of attempting to do so would have been enormous. It was easier and cheaper to agree to leave the continent alone than to compete for it. This explanation is logical, and it may account for much of the treaty's origin. But it does not account for the intensity of the restrictions, the permanence of the arrangement, or the extraordinary unanimity that has sustained it for more than 6 decades. Other international agreements from the same era, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, the Law of the Sea, have all been subject to disputes, withdrawals, and violations. The Antarctic Treaty has not. It stands alone in its durability, its completeness, and the absolute compliance of its signatories. And the question that this durability raises is not whether the treaty is a good idea, It almost certainly is, but whether its true purpose is fully captured by its stated objectives, whether, beneath the language of environmental protection and scientific cooperation, there exists a deeper motive, a shared understanding among the world's most powerful nations that something about Antarctica must remain undisturbed. Not because it is fragile, but because it is significant. And significance, when it's buried beneath 4 kilometers of ice at the bottom of the world, looks exactly like silence. Scattered across every inhabited continent, separated by oceans and millennia, there are stones that should not exist where they stand. They are too large, too heavy, too precisely cut, and too perfectly aligned to be explained by the tools and techniques that mainstream archaeology attributes to their builders. They appear in deserts and jungles, on mountain tops and coastal plains, in places where no modern crane could easily operate, and no quarry exists within reasonable distance. They share no common language, no documented trade route, no obvious cultural transmission. And yet, when one examines them side by side, when one lays their measurements on the same table and compares their geometries, their orientations, their astronomical alignments, patterns emerge that are difficult to attribute to coincidence. The question these stones pose is not whether ancient people were capable of remarkable engineering. They clearly were. The question is whether they all learned it independently, in isolation, across thousands of years and thousands of miles, or whether they inherited it from somewhere older, somewhere that no longer appears on any map. In southeastern Turkey, near the Syrian border, a hilltop called Göbekli Tepe has quietly overturned one of the most fundamental assumptions of archaeological science. The site was first surveyed in the 1960s by a joint team from the University of Istanbul and the University of Chicago, but it was dismissed as a medieval cemetery. It was not until 1994, when the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt revisited the site, that the true nature of the structures became apparent. Beneath the surface lay a complex of massive stone enclosures, circular arrangements of T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing more than 5 meters tall and weighing up to 15 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals, abstract symbols and humanoid figures. Radiocarbon dating placed the oldest layers of the site at approximately 9,600 BCE, more than 11,600 years ago. This is roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza, and, most critically, more than 4,000 years before the earliest known agricultural settlements in the region. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, or at least by people whom conventional archaeology classifies as hunter-gatherers, because no evidence of domesticated crops or permanent dwellings has been found at the site's earliest levels. The implications are staggering. The standard model of human development, the Neolithic Revolution, holds that agriculture came first, followed by permanent settlement, followed by social complexity, followed by monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe inverts this sequence entirely. Here, the monumental architecture came first. The organizational capacity, the artistic sophistication, the engineering knowledge required to quarry, transport, carve and erect pillars of this size and precision, all of it preceded the agricultural revolution by thousands of years. Schmidt himself described the site as a cathedral on a hill, and suggested that it was the construction of such gathering places that may have driven the development of agriculture, rather than the other way around. The need to feed the workers who built the temple may have created the incentive to cultivate crops. If this is correct, then the entire narrative of civilization's origins, the story we have been told about the slow, linear progression from savagery to settlement to sophistication, is not merely incomplete, it is backwards, and Göbekli Tepe does not stand alone. 6,000 kilometers to the west on the coast of Lebanon, the ruins of Baalbek present a different kind of mystery, not of age, but of scale. The Roman temple complex at Baalbek, known as Heliopolis in antiquity, is one of the most impressive architectural achievements of the ancient Mediterranean. The Temple of Jupiter, the Temple of Bacchus, and the surrounding structures are monumental by any standard. But beneath the Roman construction, forming the foundation upon which the temples were built, lies a platform of stone blocks so massive that they defy easy explanation. 3 of these blocks, known as the trilithon, each weigh approximately 800 metric tons. A 4th block, still partially attached to its quarry about a kilometre away, weighs an estimated 1,200 metric tons, the largest worked stone in the ancient world. The Romans, for all their engineering genius, never moved stones of this size anywhere else in their empire. The quarrying and transport techniques required to handle blocks of 800 to 1,200 tons are not documented in any Roman engineering text, and no Roman-era tool marks have been identified on the trilithon stones. The question of who placed them there, and when, remains officially unanswered. The same unsettling pattern appears at Pumapunku, a site in the Bolivian Altiplano near the shore of Lake Titicaca, at an altitude of nearly 3,800 metres. Pumapunku is part of the larger Tiwanaku complex, a pre-Columbian archaeological site that flourished between approximately 500 and 1000 CE. But the stonework at Pumapunku is qualitatively different from anything else at Tiwanaku, or arguably from anything else in the pre-Columbian Americas. The blocks are cut from andesite and red sandstone with a precision that suggests the use of tools and techniques far beyond what is conventionally attributed to the Tiwanaku culture. Flat surfaces are machined tolerances that would be difficult to achieve with modern equipment. Interlocking joints fit together without mortar, in configurations that resemble modular construction. Right angles are exact, drill holes are uniform, and the blocks themselves, some weighing more than 100 tons, were transported from quarries more than 10 kilometres away, across terrain that offers no obvious means of conveyance. The Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon, who visited the site in the 16th century, recorded the local Aymara people's own tradition about Pumapunku, that the stones had been placed there by giants in a single night, long before the Inca or the Tiwanaku. It was a mythological explanation for something that even the people who lived beside it could not explain through ordinary memory. And then there is Easter Island, Rapa Nui, the most isolated inhabited island on Earth, sitting alone in the southeastern Pacific more than 3,500 kilometres from the coast of Chile. The Moai, the massive stone statues that line the island's coast, are among the most recognisable archaeological monuments in the world. Nearly 1,000 of them were carved from volcanic tuff at the Reanuraraku quarry, some standing more than 10 metres tall and weighing up to 82 tons. The conventional explanation for their transport involves log rollers, sledges, and organised labour, and experimental archaeology has demonstrated that these methods are feasible, if laborious. But the deeper mystery of Easter Island is not how the statues were moved. It is why a small, isolated population, on an island with limited resources, devoted such an extraordinary proportion of its labour and material to the creation of monumental stone figures, and why the design of those figures with their elongated faces, heavy brows and stylized features bears a resemblance to megalithic carvings found thousands of miles away, in cultures that had no documented contact with Rapa Nui. Resemblance is not proof, pattern is not causation. But when the same impulse, the same drive to quarry, carve and erect enormous stones in precise configurations, appears independently in Turkey, Lebanon, Bolivia and the remote Pacific, the observer is left with 2 possibilities. Either the human species is hardwired to produce megalithic architecture spontaneously across every environment and every era, or the knowledge came from somewhere that connected these places before the connections were severed, somewhere perhaps that now lies beneath the ice. Approximately 12,800 years ago, the world ended. Not completely, not in the absolute sense of extinction, but in a way that was sudden enough, violent enough, and comprehensive enough to constitute a rupture in the trajectory of life on Earth. The climate, which had been warming steadily since the peak of the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, reversed course with a speed that the geological record rarely documents. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere plummeted by as much as 7 degrees Celsius within decades, possibly within years. Glaciers that had been retreating surged forward again. Forests that had been spreading northward died back. Ocean currents shifted. Rainfall patterns collapsed. And across North America, Europe, and parts of South America and the Middle East, the megafauna, the great beasts that had dominated the landscape for hundreds of thousands of years, vanished. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, American camels, American horses, more than 35 genera of large animals disappeared from the Americas alone, in a wave of extinction so concentrated and so severe that it has no parallel in the preceding 100,000 years. This event is known as the Younger Dryas, and its cause has been debated by scientists for more than a century. But in recent decades, a hypothesis has emerged that connects this catastrophe not only to the climate, but to the possibility that an entire civilization was erased from the face of the Earth. The standard explanation for the Younger Dryas cooling has long focused on the disruption of Atlantic Ocean circulation. The prevailing theory, articulated most fully by Wallace Brucker of Columbia University in the 1980s and 1990s, proposes that the sudden drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz, an enormous freshwater body that covered much of central Canada during the last ice age, flooded the North Atlantic with cold, low salinity water, shutting down the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great oceanic conveyor belt that transports warm water from the tropics to the northern latitudes. Without this heat transport, temperatures crashed, and the world was plunged back into near glacial conditions for approximately 1,200 years, until the circulation recovered and the Holocene, the current warm period, began around 11,600 years ago. This model is elegant, well supported by oceanographic data, and widely accepted within the climate science community, but it does not explain everything. It does not account for the megafaunal extinctions, which were too sudden and too geographically widespread to be attributed solely to gradual cooling. It does not explain the presence of anomalous geological deposits found at dozens of sites across multiple continents. And it does not address the growing body of evidence suggesting that the Younger Dryas was triggered not by a slow hydrological process, but by something far more violent. In 2007, a team of researchers led by nuclear physicist Richard Firestone of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a paper that proposed a radical alternative. They argued that the Younger Dryas was initiated by a cosmic impact, the airburst or surface collision of a large comet or asteroid, or possibly multiple fragments of a disintegrating comet, striking the Laurentide ice sheet that covered much of North America at the time. The evidence they cited was specific and material. At more than 50 sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, they identified a distinct sedimentary layer, a thin, dark boundary, dating to approximately 12,800 years before present, that contained anomalous concentrations of nanodiamonds, magnetic microspherules, iridium, charcoal, soot, and fullerenes, materials associated with high-temperature, high-pressure events such as meteorite impacts, or large-scale wildfires ignited by atmospheric detonation. This boundary layer, they argued, was the signature of a catastrophic event, a bombardment that shattered the ice sheet, destabilized the global climate, ignited continent-wide wildfires, and created conditions that no megafaunal population and no human society could survive unchanged. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, as it came to be known, was immediately controversial. Critics argued that the nanodiamonds could be formed by terrestrial processes, that the magnetic spherules were volcanic in origin, and that the charcoal layers were consistent with natural wildfires rather than impact-induced conflagrations. Several studies attempted to replicate the original findings and reported mixed results. The debate has continued for nearly 2 decades, with new evidence and counter-evidence published regularly. But the hypothesis has not been abandoned. In 2018, a study published in the Journal of Geology by a team led by Wendy Walbach of DePaul University analysed more than 170 sedimentary profiles from across the globe and concluded that the evidence for widespread biomass burning at the Younger Dryas boundary was robust, consistent with a major conflagration that consumed approximately 10% of the Earth's terrestrial biomass. The fire, they estimated, would have released enough soot and particulate matter into the atmosphere to trigger a period of global cooling lasting years, an impact winter analogous to the nuclear winter scenarios modelled during the Cold War. And in 2018 and 2019, the discovery of the Hiawatha impact crater beneath the Greenland ice sheet, a 31-kilometre wide depression detected by airborne radar, provided the first potential physical evidence of a large impact event in the right geographic and temporal vicinity. Although precise dating of the crater remains contested, what does any of this have to do with Tartaria, or with Antarctica, or with maps drawn on gazelle skin in Ottoman workshops? The connection is not direct. It is circumstantial, layered, and speculative, but it is also logical if one is willing to follow the thread. If the Younger Dryas was caused by a cosmic impact, or a series of impacts, then the event would have been globally catastrophic. Ice sheets would have shattered and surged. Sea levels, initially suppressed, would have risen dramatically as the melting resumed after the cold period ended. Coastal civilizations, the kind most likely to develop navigation, trade, and the cartographic knowledge reflected in maps like the Piri Reis, would have been destroyed, submerged, or buried. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, would have carried fragments of knowledge forward, myths of a great flood, memories of a lost homeland, technical skills preserved in oral tradition, or encoded in monument construction. But the civilization itself, the organized society that produced the knowledge, would have been gone, erased not by a conquering army or a jealous emperor, but by fire and ice and the indifferent mechanics of the cosmos. And if that civilization had existed not only in the northern hemisphere, not only in the river valleys and coastal plains of the lands we know, but also in regions that are now buried beneath ice, then the evidence of its existence would be precisely where we cannot reach it. Beneath the Greenland ice sheet, beneath the glaciers of Patagonia, and most especially beneath the 4-kilometre thick ice cap of Antarctica, a continent that, as the fossil record shows, was once warm enough to support forests, rivers, and complex ecosystems. The Younger Dryas did not merely change the climate, it reset the world. It drew a line across the timeline of human existence, and everything before that line became myth, legend, or silence. The question is whether the silence is empty, or whether it is full, packed tight with the compressed remains of something the ice has kept hidden, something the treaties have kept guarded, and something the maps, those strange and beautiful old maps, have been trying to tell us for 500 years. In 1995, a British journalist named Graham Hancock published a book that would become one of the most polarising works in the history of popular archaeology. Fingerprints of the Gods drew on 2 decades of travel, research and pattern recognition to advance a single sweeping argument that a technologically advanced civilization had existed during the last ice age, had been destroyed by a global cataclysm approximately 12,000 years ago, and that its survivors had seeded the great ancient cultures of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and the Andes with fragments of their knowledge. Hancock did not claim to know who these people were, where their homeland was located, or what specific technologies they possessed. He claimed only that the evidence, architectural, astronomical, mythological, geological, pointed toward a missing chapter in human history, a chapter that mainstream academia had either overlooked or refused to examine. The book sold millions of copies. It was translated into dozens of languages, and it made Hancock one of the most famous and most attacked writers in the English-speaking world. The academic response was swift, coordinated, and hostile. Archaeologists, Egyptologists, and geologists dismissed the book as pseudoscience, pointing to errors in methodology, selective use of evidence, and logical leaps unsupported by the material record. The Society of American Archaeology never engaged with Hancock's arguments directly, but made clear through institutional channels that his work was not considered legitimate scholarship. Individual researchers were more vocal. Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen called the lost civilization hypothesis nonsense. Geologist Ian Plimer described it as a retreat from reason. The criticism was not entirely unfair. Hancock was not a trained archaeologist. His reasoning was often speculative, and some of his early claims, particularly regarding the age of the Sphinx and the alignment of the Giza pyramids with the constellation Orion, relied on interpretations that did not withstand rigorous scrutiny. But the intensity of the reaction, the institutional hostility, the personal attacks, the refusal to engage with the broader questions Hancock raised, suggested something beyond ordinary academic disagreement. It suggested discomfort. The kind of discomfort that arises not when a hypothesis is obviously wrong, but when it is close enough to a sensitive truth that its mere discussion threatens the stability of established narratives. Because beneath the specific claims, beneath the Sphinx, beneath the pyramids, beneath the Nazca lines and the Piri Reis map, the core of Hancock's argument rested on a simple observation that has only grown stronger in the 3 decades since Fingerprints of the Gods was published. The observation is this: the conventional timeline of human civilization, which places the earliest complex societies in Mesopotamia and Egypt, around 3,500 to 3000 BCE, does not adequately account for the full range of archaeological evidence that has been discovered in the past century. There are structures that are too old, skills that appear too suddenly, and mythological traditions that are too consistent across unconnected cultures to be explained by the standard model of independent parallel development. Something is missing from the story. Something happened before the beginning, before Sumer, before the pharaohs, before the first cuneiform tablet was pressed into wet clay, and whatever it was, it left traces that the standard model has been unable to absorb without cracking. Göbekli Tepe cracked the model wide open. When Klaus Schmidt began excavating the site in earnest in the mid-1990s, at almost exactly the same time Hancock was publishing Fingerprints of the Gods, the mainstream archaeological community was confronted with evidence that did not fit. Here was a monumental complex built with sophisticated engineering and rich artistic expression, dating to a period when humans were supposed to be nomadic hunter-gatherers incapable of organised construction. The site was not a settlement. It had no domestic architecture, no water source, no agricultural infrastructure. It appeared to be a ritual or ceremonial centre, a gathering place built by people who travelled significant distances to participate in its construction and use. And it was old. Older than pottery, older than metallurgy, older than writing, older than any permanent village yet discovered. Its very existence was an affront to the Neolithic Revolution model, which held that agriculture came first and everything else followed. At Göbekli Tepe, the order was reversed. The temple came first, the skills came first, the knowledge came first, and the question that followed, where did that knowledge come from, had no comfortable answer within the existing framework. Schmidt himself was cautious in his interpretations. He did not endorse Hancock's lost civilization hypothesis. He described Göbekli Tepe as evidence that the cognitive and organizational capacities of late Pleistocene humans had been severely underestimated, that the transition from foraging to farming was not a sudden revolution, but a long, complex process in which ritual and symbolic life played a driving role. This interpretation was reasonable and well supported, but it left a residual question that Schmidt acknowledged in interviews before his death in 2014. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed the knowledge and social organisation to construct a site of this complexity at 9,600 BCE, what were their ancestors doing in the millennia before? The site does not appear to represent a beginning. Its sophistication suggests a long developmental trajectory, centuries, possibly millennia, of accumulated skill and tradition. But no earlier sites of comparable complexity have been found. The developmental trajectory, if it exists, is invisible. It is as though the knowledge appeared fully formed, without precedent, or as though the precedents have been destroyed, submerged, or buried beyond the reach of current archaeology. This is the gap that Hancock identified, and it is the gap that the academic establishment has struggled to fill. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe did not prove the existence of a lost civilization, but it demonstrated, with physical evidence that no one could dismiss, that the story of human development was far more complex than the textbooks allowed. It showed that organized, skilled, symbolically rich societies existed thousands of years before the conventional starting point of civilization. And it forced even the most conservative archaeologists to admit that the deep past contained surprises, that the period between the end of the last ice age and the rise of the first known city-states was not an empty void, but a populated, active and creative era whose full dimensions remain unknown. Hancock updated and expanded his arguments in subsequent books, Magicians of the Gods in 2015, America Before in 2019, incorporating the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis and the growing body of evidence for catastrophic events at the end of the Pleistocene. His work remained controversial, and his critics remained vocal, but the ground had shifted beneath them. The evidence from Göbekli Tepe, from the Younger Dryas boundary layer, from subglacial lakes and anomalous maps and megafaunal extinctions had accumulated to a point where the old certainties no longer held. The timeline was broken, the narrative was incomplete, and the question that Hancock had been asking since 1995, the question that earned him ridicule and condemnation from the very institutions tasked with uncovering the past, had become impossible to ignore. What if there was a civilization before civilization? What if it was advanced enough to survey coastlines, align monuments to stars, and encode its knowledge in stone? What if it was destroyed, not by conquest but by cosmic catastrophe, and its remains now lie in the places we are least able or least willing to look? Beneath the ocean, beneath the desert, beneath the ice. The stones at Göbekli Tepe do not answer these questions, but they stand, heavy and silent and impossibly old, as proof that the questions deserve to be asked, and that the silence of the establishment is not the same as an answer. There is a peculiar feature shared by old cities across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia that rarely receives the attention it deserves. Walk through the historic centres of Edinburgh, Portland, Seattle, Melbourne, or dozens of other cities built during the 18th and 19th centuries, and you will notice something strange. The ground floors of the oldest buildings are not ground floors at all. They are basements. In some cases, entire streets that were once at surface level now sit below the current road grade, accessible only by descending staircases or through passageways that were sealed decades or centuries ago. In Seattle, the phenomenon is so pronounced that a network of underground corridors, the remnants of the original street level, has become a tourist attraction, marketed as the Seattle Underground. The official explanation varies by city. In Seattle, the streets were raised after the Great Fire of 1889 to improve drainage and sanitation. In Edinburgh, the construction of the South Bridge in the 1780s created vaulted chambers beneath the street that were eventually abandoned and forgotten. In Portland, a system of tunnels known as the Shanghai Tunnels connected basements of hotels and bars to the waterfront, allegedly used for kidnapping men into forced labour on ships. Each explanation is local, specific, and architecturally plausible. But when one steps back and views the pattern as a whole, buried first floors, sunken streets, sealed underground networks, in cities separated by oceans and decades, the question that emerges is not whether each individual explanation is correct, but whether the collective phenomenon points to something larger, the idea that a layer of civilization has been buried, literally physically covered by mud, debris, or deliberate infill, is not a fringe theory. It is an observable architectural fact in dozens of cities. The question is what caused the burial, and whether the explanations offered account for the full scope of the evidence. In some cases, the answer is clearly mundane. Cities do raise their street levels. Drainage improvements, fire rebuilding, and urban renewal projects regularly result in older structures being partially submerged beneath new construction. Rome itself sits atop multiple layers of previous cities. The modern street level in the Forum area is roughly 10 metres above the Republican-era pavement. But Rome's layering took place over 2,000 years of continuous occupation. The buried floors of 19th century American cities occurred within a span of decades, sometimes within a single generation. The speed of the burial in these cases is more difficult to explain through normal urban development alone. And then there are the buildings themselves, structures of the late 19th century that seem, to some observers, incongruent with the societies that supposedly built them. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago is perhaps the most striking example. Known as the White City, the exposition featured more than 200 buildings constructed in a neoclassical style of extraordinary grandeur. Massive colonnaded halls, domed pavilions, sculptured facades, and reflecting pools that covered nearly 700 acres along the shore of Lake Michigan. The buildings were designed by the most prominent architects of the era, including Daniel Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted, and Charles McKim. They were clad in a material called staff, a mixture of plite, cement, and jute fibre, applied over steel and wooden frames to create the appearance of white marble. The official record states that the buildings were temporary structures, designed to last only for the duration of the exposition, and that most were demolished or destroyed by fire shortly after the fair closed in October 1893. Of the more than 200 structures, only a handful survive in any form, most notably the Palace of Fine Arts, which became the Museum of Science and Industry. The scale and speed of the construction have invited scrutiny. The exposition was conceived in 1890, construction began in earnest in 1891, and the fair opened in May 1893. In less than 3 years, a miniature city of monumental proportions was erected on a swampy lakefront site, complete with electric lighting, running water, sewage systems, elevated railways and moving walkways. Then, within months of its closing, virtually all of it was destroyed. The manufacturers and liberal arts building alone covered nearly 200,000 square metres, at the time the largest building in the world by footprint. The effort required to build such structures in such a compressed timeline, using the construction methods of the 1890s, is a subject of legitimate engineering debate. Some researchers have questioned whether the buildings were truly temporary, pointing to the sophistication of their design, the quality of their ornamentation, and the enormous cost of their construction, estimated at nearly $30 million in 1893 dollars, equivalent to roughly $1 billion today. Why build something so magnificent, so expensive, and so technically accomplished, only to tear it down within a year? The same question arises with the Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904 in St. Louis, the Pan American Exposition of 1901 in Buffalo, and numerous other World's Fairs of the era, each featuring monumental architecture of astonishing complexity, each described as temporary and each demolished shortly after closing. The pattern is consistent and to certain observers suspicious. Were these truly buildings created from scratch in 2 or 3 years, by horse-drawn wagons and manual labour, only to be destroyed on purpose? Or is it possible that some of these structures were older than their attributed dates, repurposed, relabelled, and then removed once they had served their public function? The question sounds extreme, and the mainstream answer is unequivocal. The buildings were new, temporary, and their demolition is fully documented. But the question persists among those who study the architecture of the 19th century with an eye toward anomalies, because the craftsmanship displayed in photographs of these fairs, the intricate carvings, the harmonious proportions, the sheer volumetric ambition, seems at times to exceed what the available labour, tools and timelines would reasonably permit. Connected to this architectural unease is the phenomenon of star forts, geometric military fortifications characterised by angular bastions projecting outward from a central enclosure, creating a star-shaped footprint when viewed from above. Star forts exist on every inhabited continent, from the citadels of Vauban in France to the Portuguese forts of Mozambique, from the Dutch fortifications of Indonesia to the Spanish defences of the Philippines, from the Russian fortress of Kronstadt to the earthworks of the American Civil War. The conventional explanation is well established. The star fort design emerged in 15th century Italy as a response to the development of cannon warfare. Angled walls deflected cannonballs more effectively than flat medieval curtain walls, and projecting bastions allowed defenders to cover the approaches to adjacent walls with crossfire. The design was refined by military engineers including Michel Sanmicheli, Sebastiano Serlio, and later Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, whose fortification systems became the standard for European military architecture from the 17th century onward. The global distribution of star forts is explained by European colonialism. Wherever European powers established military outposts, they brought their fortification techniques with them. This explanation is logical, well documented, and almost certainly correct in most cases. But it does not entirely account for the uniformity of the design across cultures and continents. Some researchers have noted that star-shaped or geometrically angular earthworks exist in regions that were not directly influenced by European military engineering, in parts of Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and South America, raising the question of whether the geometry was independently discovered or inherited from an older shared tradition. The geometric precision of these structures, their symmetry, their mathematical regularity, their consistent orientation, resonates with the same pattern observed in megalithic sites, a global distribution of architectural forms that seem too similar, too sophisticated, and too widespread to be fully explained by independent invention or colonial transmission alone. The star forts may be exactly what they appear to be, the product of a well-documented European military tradition, or they may be the latest iteration of something much older, built on foundations that have been buried, relabeled, or absorbed into narratives that obscure their true origins. The buried streets, the demolished palaces, the geometric forts, all of them whisper the same quiet question. What was here before? And who decided that it should be forgotten? Every student of history learns dates. 753 BCE for the founding of Rome, 323 BCE for the death of Alexander, 476 CE for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 1066 for the Norman conquest. These numbers are accepted as fixed points, anchors in the current of time that allow the past to be organised, measured and taught. But very few students are ever asked a more fundamental question. Who decided these dates? Who built the timeline itself? The chronological framework upon which every historical event is placed, every dynasty ordered, every civilization sequenced? The answer leads to a surprisingly small number of men, working in a surprisingly narrow period, using methods that were, by the standards of modern science, remarkably subjective. And once one begins to examine how the timeline was constructed, the certainty that surrounds it begins to feel less like bedrock and more like scaffolding, functional, perhaps even necessary, but not the same thing as the building it supports. The modern chronological framework of world history was largely established by a single scholar, Joseph Justus Scaliger. Born in 1540 in Argonne, France, Scaliger was the son of the Italian physician and classical scholar Julius Caesar Scaliger, and he grew to become one of the most formidable intellects of the European Renaissance. His mastery of languages was legendary. He read Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Persian, and several other tongues with fluency. and his ambition was nothing less than to construct a unified timeline of all human history, from the biblical creation to his own era. In 1583, he published De Emendatione Temporum, a work that attempted to reconcile the competing chronologies of the ancient world, Egyptian, Babylonian, Greek, Roman, Hebrew, into a single coherent sequence. In 1606 he followed with the Thesaurus Temporum, a compilation and reconstruction of the Chronicon of Eusebius of Caesarea, the 4th century Christian historian whose own chronological tables had served as the foundation of medieval European timekeeping. Scaliger's achievement was monumental. He created the system of dating, the Julian period, the correlation of regnal years, the synchronization of parallel timelines, that remains, in its essentials, the framework used by historians to this day. But Scaliger worked with tools that were, by necessity, imperfect. He had no radiocarbon dating. He had no dendrochronology. He had no ice core analysis, no thermoluminescence, no satellite imagery. He worked with texts, manuscripts copied and recopied by generations of scribes, translated across languages, interpreted through the lens of religious and political assumptions that shaped what could and could not be accepted as true. His chronology was, in large part, a literary construction, an attempt to weave a coherent narrative from sources that often contradicted one another, by making choices about which texts to trust, which to reject, and which to reinterpret. These choices were informed by extraordinary erudition, but they were choices nonetheless, acts of judgment, not acts of measurement. And once those judgments were codified, published, and absorbed into the educational institutions of Europe, they acquired the weight of fact. Subsequent generations of historians built upon Scaliger's framework without questioning its foundations, in the same way that later builders construct on existing foundations without excavating to see what lies beneath. It was this unexamined foundation that attracted the attention of Anatoly Fomenko, a Russian mathematician and member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Fomenko is not an obscure figure. He is a topologist of international standing, a recipient of the State Prize of the Russian Federation, and the author of more than 200 mathematical publications. Beginning in the 1980s, Fomenko applied statistical methods to historical chronology, analysing the durations of royal dynasties, the patterns of recorded events, and the frequency distributions of historical data, and arrived at a conclusion that was, by any standard, radical. He argued that the conventional chronology of world history was artificially inflated, that events attributed to antiquity had, in many cases, been duplicated, misattributed, or invented by medieval and Renaissance scholars, and that the actual timeline of recorded history was significantly shorter than the Scaligerian framework suggested. His hypothesis, known as the new chronology, proposed that much of what is taught as ancient history, including large portions of Greek, Roman, and Egyptian history, is a distorted reflection of medieval events, projected backward in time through errors, forgeries, and deliberate manipulation. The new chronology has been rejected by virtually every professional historian and archaeologist who has examined it. The criticisms are numerous and in many cases devastating. Fomenko's statistical methods have been challenged as inappropriate for historical data. His textual analyses have been accused of selectivity and misinterpretation. His dismissal of radiocarbon dating and other independent chronometric methods has been described as scientifically illiterate, and his broader conclusions that the Roman Empire, ancient Greece, and pharaonic Egypt as traditionally understood are largely fictional constructs are considered absurd by the overwhelming consensus of historical scholarship. These criticisms are serious, and many of them are well-founded. Fomenko's specific claims about the identity of historical figures and the relocation of entire civilizations frequently cross the line from speculation into fantasy. But beneath the extravagance of his conclusions, Fomenko raised a question that is harder to dismiss than the answers he offered. The question is this: how reliable is a chronological framework that was constructed by a handful of scholars in the 16th and 17th centuries using methods that would not survive peer review in any modern scientific discipline. The fact that Fomenko's alternative is almost certainly wrong does not mean that Scaliger's original construction is beyond doubt. It means only that the problem of historical chronology, the problem of knowing with genuine certainty when things happened, is more difficult and more fragile than most people realize. And this fragility has consequences that extend far beyond academic debate. Because if the timeline can be questioned, if the sequence of empires and eras is less fixed than it appears, then the disappearance of Tartaria from that timeline becomes not merely a cartographic curiosity, but a symptom of a deeper instability in the way history itself has been organized and transmitted. Consider the mechanics of chronological construction in the early modern period. Scaliger and his successors relied heavily on the works of a small number of ancient and medieval chroniclers: Eusebius, Jerome, Bede, Isidore of Seville, the Byzantine chronographers. These sources were themselves dependent on earlier sources, many of which no longer survive. The chain of transmission is long, fragile, and punctuated by gaps. Manuscripts were copied by hand, often by monks whose primary concern was theological rather than historical accuracy. Dates were expressed in regnal years, Olympiads, consular lists, and local calendars that did not always correlate cleanly with one another. The conversion of these disparate systems into a unified chronology required interpolation, estimation, and, inevitably, error. How much error is embedded in the system is a question that has no definitive answer, because the tools used to check the chronology, radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, astronomical retrocalculation, are themselves calibrated against the very framework they are supposed to verify. The circularity is not absolute, but it is present, and it introduces a margin of uncertainty that is rarely acknowledged in popular presentations of historical chronology. None of this proves that the timeline is wrong. It proves only that the timeline is a construction, a human artifact, assembled from imperfect materials by imperfect hands, and maintained by institutions that have a vested interest in its stability. And constructions, unlike discoveries, can be altered. They can be expanded, compressed, rearranged, or selectively edited to serve the needs of those who control them. If Tartaria was real, if it represented a genuine political, cultural, or civilizational entity that existed outside the framework Scaliger built, then its absence from the modern timeline would require no conspiracy, no secret cabal, no hidden hand. It would require only the ordinary operation of a system designed to organize the past according to the assumptions and priorities of the men who built it. And those men, brilliant as they were, did not know everything. They could not see the maps that had not yet been found, the sites that had not yet been excavated, the ice cores that had not yet been drilled. They built the best framework they could with the tools they had, but the framework is not the past. It is a story about the past, and stories, as every civilization that has ever burned a library understands, can be rewritten. In 1966, a geologist named Virginia McIntyre was invited to date a set of stone tools found at the Hueyatlaco archaeological site near Puebla, Mexico. The tools were sophisticated, by facially worked blades and scrapers of a type associated with anatomically modern humans. The site had been excavated by Cynthia Irwin Williams of Harvard University, and the expectation was that the artifacts would date to roughly 20,000 years ago, consistent with the prevailing understanding of human migration into the Americas. McIntyre applied uranium series dating to the volcanic sediment surrounding the tools. The result was not 20,000 years, it was not 40,000. The dates came back at approximately 250,000 years before present. McIntyre was stunned. She repeated the tests. She used additional methods, fission track dating and tephra hydration analysis. The results converged on the same figure. She reported her findings, and then her career effectively ended. Her results were not refuted on technical grounds. They were simply ignored. Irwin Williams distanced herself from the dates. The Geological Society of America declined to publish McIntyre's paper. She was unable to secure further funding. The site was never re-excavated with modern techniques, and the stone tools of Huayatlaco, objects that, according to 3 independent dating methods, were 250,000 years old, were quietly filed away, neither explained nor acknowledged in the long catalogue of things that do not fit. Michael Cremo and Richard Thompson documented dozens of cases like Huayatlaco in their 1993 book Forbidden Archaeology, a massive and meticulously referenced volume that assembled anomalous archaeological findings from the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, artifacts, skeletal remains, and tool marks that, if taken at face value, would require a radical revision of the accepted timeline of human evolution and cultural development. Cremo and Thompson were not trained archaeologists. Cremo is a member of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, affiliated with the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, and his philosophical framework was influenced by Vedic cosmology, which posits a cyclical model of time far older than the linear progression of mainstream Western science. This background made it easy for critics to dismiss the book as religiously motivated pseudoscience, and some of the cases Cremo cited have been convincingly reinterpreted or debunked by subsequent research. But the core catalogue, the sheer volume of anomalous findings, drawn from peer-reviewed journals, geological surveys, and the published proceedings of scientific societies, resist wholesale dismissal. What Cremo demonstrated, regardless of his philosophical motives, was that the archaeological establishment has a long and documented history of suppressing, ignoring, or reinterpreting evidence that contradicts the accepted narrative, not through conspiracy, necessarily, but through the ordinary mechanisms of institutional science, the filtering of grant applications, the gatekeeping of peer review, the social pressure to conform to prevailing paradigms. Thomas Kuhn described this process in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962. Anomalies accumulate silently, absorbed or ignored by the dominant paradigm until the weight becomes too great and the paradigm shifts. The question is whether the anomalies Cremo catalogued, and the many others that have surfaced since, are approaching that critical mass. The objects themselves are haunting. They sit in museum storage rooms and private collections, labelled and catalogued but rarely displayed, because they raise questions that the institutions housing them are not prepared to answer. The term used to describe them, OP arts, or out-of-place artifacts, captures the essential problem. These are objects found in geological or archaeological contexts that do not match their apparent level of technological sophistication. They are too advanced for their age, or too old for their location, or both. Some have been explained satisfactorily, others have not, and a small number remain genuinely puzzling, resistant to easy classification, sitting like stones in the shoe of conventional archaeology. The Antikythera mechanism is the most famous. Recovered in 1901 from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, it is a corroded bronze device containing at least 37 interlocking gears, a mechanical instrument of a complexity that was not seen again in the historical record for more than 1,000 years. Decades of study, culminating in high-resolution X-ray tomography by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project in the 2000s, revealed that the device was capable of tracking the movements of the Sun, Moon, and at least 5 planets, predicting lunar and solar eclipses, and marking the dates of the ancient Olympic Games. It has been called the world's first analog computer. Its construction implies a tradition of precision gear cutting and astronomical knowledge that far exceeds what is conventionally attributed to Hellenistic Greece. Who built it, and what intellectual lineage produced the knowledge required to design it, remain open questions. A recent study by Argentine researchers even proposed that the device's gear ratios, when modelled computationally, produced errors too large for practical astronomical prediction, raising the possibility that the mechanism was not a scientific instrument at all, but an educational demonstration or, most provocatively, a sophisticated philosophical toy. If even the Antikythera mechanism, the most studied, most authenticated OOP art in existence, can generate fundamental disagreements about its purpose and origin. The uncertainty surrounding less well-documented anomalies becomes all the more significant. Then there is the London hammer, discovered in the 1930s near London, Texas, a metal hammerhead encased in a nodule of Ordovician-age limestone, ostensibly dating to approximately 400 million years ago. The artifact was brought to public attention by Carl Bohr, a controversial creationist who founded the Creation Evidence Museum. Mainstream geologists have argued that the hammer is modern, likely 19th century, and that the limestone concretion formed around it through rapid mineral precipitation, not deep-time geological processes. This explanation is widely accepted and probably correct, but the artifact continues to circulate in alternative history literature because it highlights a genuine methodological issue: the difficulty of dating objects found out of context, and the extent to which the interpretation of an artifact depends on the assumptions brought to it by the interpreter. More resistant to easy explanation are the Klerksdorp spheres, small, roughly spherical objects found in pyrophyllite deposits near Ottosdal, South Africa, in rock layers estimated at approximately 2.8 billion years old. The spheres are typically a few centimeters in diameter, some with parallel grooves running around their equators. They have been cited by alternative researchers as evidence of intelligent manufacture in the deep geological past, an idea that, if true, would overturn every aspect of the conventional understanding of Earth's history. Geologists, however, have identified the spheres as natural concretions, mineral formations created by the precipitation of volcanic sediments, and have pointed to well-documented geological processes capable of producing similar shapes and surface features. The grooves, they argue, are the result of natural lamination in the surrounding rock. This explanation is consistent with known geology and is supported by the majority of researchers who have examined the spheres. But the objects continue to provoke fascination precisely because they look manufactured, because the human eye, trained to recognize symmetry and regularity, struggles to accept that nature alone could produce objects so apparently purposeful. This is perhaps the deepest issue raised by OOP arts and anomalous findings. They challenge not only the timeline but the very process by which the timeline is defended. When an artifact does not fit the established narrative, the default response of institutional science is to find an explanation that preserves the narrative, to redate the object, reinterpret the context, or question the methods used to recover it. This response is often correct. Most anomalies do have conventional explanations, and the scientific method is, at its best, a self-correcting process that converges on truth through the elimination of error. But self-correction requires openness, a willingness to consider the possibility that the narrative itself is wrong, not just the evidence that contradicts it. And when that openness is absent, when careers are destroyed, papers are suppressed, and artifacts are locked in storage rather than subjected to further analysis, the process ceases to be science and becomes something closer to theology. A system of belief that defines its boundaries not by what the evidence shows, but by what the authorities permit. Virginia McIntyre dated the stones at Huayatlaco. The stones gave their answer, and the institutions that asked the question refused to hear it. The artifacts remain, scattered across the world like fragments of a message written in a language that no one is willing to read, not because it cannot be translated, but because what it says might change everything that has already been written down. In November 2016, United States Secretary of State John Kerry travelled to Antarctica. The visit was announced as part of a broader diplomatic tour that included New Zealand, and the stated purpose was to observe the effects of climate change firsthand, to see the melting ice, the shifting glaciers, the thinning ozone layer that had made Antarctica a symbol of environmental urgency. Kerry became the highest-ranking American official ever to visit the continent. He landed at McMurdo Station, toured the research facilities, met with scientists, and stood on the Ross Ice Shelf beneath an empty sky. The trip was covered by the press, praised by environmental organisations and filed away in the public record as a routine expression of climate diplomacy. But for those who paid close attention to the pattern of high-profile visits to Antarctica in the years surrounding Kerry's trip, the routine explanation began to feel inadequate, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Kerry was not the only powerful figure drawn to the ice that year. In February 2016, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, visited the Russian Bellingshausen station on King George Island, off the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula. The visit was described as a pastoral trip. The Patriarch was there to bless a Russian Orthodox chapel, the southernmost house of worship in the world, and to pray for the souls of Russian explorers who had died in Antarctic expeditions. The explanation was religiously appropriate, institutionally logical, and entirely unremarkable. But Patriarch Kirill had never previously expressed particular interest in Antarctica, and the logistics of transporting the head of one of the world's largest religious institutions to one of the most remote locations on Earth, with his entourage, his security detail, and the ceremonial apparatus of his office, were formidable. The trip was not casual. It was deliberate, planned, and significant within the institutional life of the Russian Orthodox Church. And it occurred within months of Kerry's visit, in a year when American-Russian relations were deteriorating sharply over Syria, Ukraine, and allegations of electoral interference. The previous year, in 2015, Buzz Aldrin, the second human to walk on the moon, a man whose name is synonymous with the American space program, visited Antarctica as part of a tourist expedition. During the trip, Aldrin, then 86 years old, suffered altitude sickness and was evacuated from the South Pole by the National Science Foundation's Antarctic medical team. He was flown to Christchurch, New Zealand for treatment and recovered fully. The incident was widely reported, and no official explanation was offered beyond the obvious medical emergency. But Aldrin's presence at the South Pole, the precise geographic location most distant from any coast, most difficult to reach, and most thoroughly buried beneath the ice sheet, raised questions in certain circles about what might have drawn a man of his age, health, and stature to such an inhospitable destination. Tourism was the stated reason. Curiosity was the assumed motive. But Aldrin had spent his career at the frontier of human exploration, and the South Pole, unlike the Moon, offers nothing to see on the surface except ice and sky, and the geometric simplicity of the research station. What, then, was worth the journey? These visits, taken individually, are unremarkable. A diplomat tours a research station, a religious leader blesses a chapel, an aging astronaut visits the last frontier. Each event has a plausible, even mundane, explanation. But taken together, compressed into a span of less than 2 years, involving figures from the highest levels of American government, Russian religious authority, and the history of space exploration, the cluster of visits acquires a weight that the individual events do not carry alone. It is the kind of pattern that invites suspicion, not because any single piece is damning, but because the pieces fit together in a way that suggests coordination, or at least a shared awareness of something that the public has not been told. And this pattern does not exist in isolation. It sits within the broader context of Antarctic secrecy. The treaty restrictions, the military operations, the classified research programs, and the persistent refusal of any government to fully disclose what has been found beneath the ice. Because things have been found. This is not speculation. It is a matter of published science. In 2017, researchers using airborne ice-penetrating radar detected a massive void beneath the Thwaites Glacier in West Antarctica, a cavity roughly 300 meters tall and 10 kilometers long, formed by rapid ice melt at the base of the glacier. The discovery, published by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, was presented as evidence of accelerating glacial retreat and a warning of potential sea level rise. But the detection method itself, the ability to image structures and voids beneath kilometers of ice using radar and satellite technology, demonstrated that the technology exists to see what lies beneath the ice sheet, even if the political will to look does not. And Thwaites is only one glacier. The interior of Antarctica, particularly East Antarctica, which is older, thicker, and less studied than the western ice sheet, remains largely unsurveyed at the resolution required to detect anything smaller than a major geological feature. What lies on the bedrock beneath East Antarctica is, for all practical purposes, unknown. The technology to find out exists. The will to deploy it comprehensively does not. Or perhaps the will exists, but the results are not shared. The fossil record adds another layer. In 2016, a team of Swedish researchers published a study in the journal Paleontology, documenting the discovery of fossilized tree stumps in the Transantarctic Mountains, dating to the Permian-Triassic boundary, approximately 252 million years ago. The trees were preserved in growth position, their root systems intact, suggesting that they had been buried rapidly by volcanic ash or sediment before they could decay. The discovery confirmed once again that Antarctica was once a forested temperate landmass, a place where complex ecosystems thrived, where life was abundant, and where conditions were radically different from the frozen desert that exists today. Similar findings have accumulated over decades. Fossilized ferns, freshwater fish, and even dinosaur bones have been recovered from exposed rock formations along the Antarctic coastline and in the dry valleys of the Transantarctic Range. Each discovery pushes back against the image of Antarctica as a place that has always been dead, always been frozen, always been empty. The continent has a biological past. It has a geological past. The question is whether it also has a human past, or a past connected to whatever civilization once mapped its coastline and recorded its features on documents that survive to this day in libraries and archives far from the ice. The connection between Tartaria and Antarctica is not drawn on any single map or written in any single document. It is drawn in the negative space, in the gaps, the silences, the forbidden zones, and the unexplained coincidences that accumulate like snow on a windless plain. A vast territory erased from the maps of Europe, a continent locked behind treaties and guarded by every major military power on Earth. Maps that show what should not have been known. Visits by powerful figures with no adequate public explanation. Fossils that prove the ice was not always there. And beneath it all, the bedrock. Unseen, unsurveyed, unreachable, holding whatever it holds in a darkness that has lasted longer than any human memory. The official narrative says there is nothing to connect these threads, that Tartaria was a cartographic error and Antarctica is a frozen wasteland and the maps are coincidences and the visits are routine and the treaty is altruistic and the silence is simply the absence of anything worth saying. And perhaps that narrative is correct. Perhaps the simplest explanation is the true one, and the patterns are illusions created by the human desire to find meaning in randomness. But the simplest explanation is not always the true one, and the ice, patient and ancient and impossibly thick, does not offer reassurances, it only waits. Ice does not forget. It does not choose what to preserve and what to discard. It does not weigh the importance of a fallen leaf against the significance of a volcanic eruption. It simply accumulates, layer upon layer, year upon year, millennium upon millennium, pressing each moment into the one beneath it with the slow, indifferent patience of geology. A single snowflake lands on a plateau in East Antarctica. It is joined by another, and another, and another, until the weight of the ones above compresses the ones below into something denser, harder, more permanent than the fragile crystal that started the process. Air is trapped between the grains. Dust settles with the snow. Pollen from distant forests. Ash from distant fires. Salt from distant seas. And in time, the snow becomes fern, and the fern becomes ice, and the ice becomes a record. A library written not in ink but in isotopes, not on parchment but in frozen breath, not by scholars but by the atmosphere itself. Every ice core drilled from the Antarctic plateau is a book, Every layer is a page, and every page contains information that no human hand wrote and no human authority can edit. The ice remembers what empires forget. There is something unsettling about a continent that holds this kind of memory, but permits no one to read it freely. The archives of nations can be opened, with time and persistence and the right legal instruments. The ruins of ancient cities can be excavated, their stones catalogued, and their inscriptions decoded. Even the ocean floor, hostile as it is, yields its secrets to submersibles and sonar and the patience of marine archaeologists. But the interior of Antarctica resists. Not because the technology does not exist, it does. Not because the scientific interest is lacking, it is abundant. It resists because the institutional structures that govern access to the continent are designed, whether by intention or by effect, to ensure that what lies beneath the ice is revealed only on terms set by the same powers that have controlled the narrative since the treaty was signed. And narratives, once established, develop a momentum of their own. They resist alteration not because they are true, but because too many structures, academic, political, economic, theological, have been built upon them. To question the narrative is to question the structures, and to question the structures is to threaten the authority of those who maintain them. The story of Tartaria is not, in the end, a story about a single empire. It is a story about the fragility of memory, about how easily the record of what was can be overwritten by the preferences of what is. A name existed on maps for more than 200 years. It referred to a territory larger than any European nation, recognized by the most rigorous scholars of its era, documented in the most authoritative encyclopedias of the Enlightenment, and then it was removed. Not by war, not by plague, not by any single event that left a scar on the landscape. It was removed by the quiet, cumulative process of editorial revision, one atlas at a time, one generation at a time, until the name itself became an artifact, a curiosity, a word that provokes not recognition, but confusion. If this can happen to a territory that occupied half of Asia, what else can happen? What other names have been removed? What other chapters have been closed? What other memories have been compressed beneath the weight of newer, more convenient truths until they are no longer visible on the surface? The maps remain. The Piri Reis map, preserved behind glass in the Topkapi Palace. The Orontius Phaneus map, studied and debated by cartographic historians for decades. The Boache map, with its impossible depiction of an ice-free Antarctica, divided into two land masses. These documents are not hidden. They're publicly available, catalogued and photographed, and yet they are treated by the institutions responsible for interpreting them as anomalies, interesting curiosities that do not quite fit the accepted history of geographic knowledge, and that are therefore filed under unexplained, rather than allowed to reshape the explanations themselves. The maps do not prove that an advanced pre-ice civilization existed in Antarctica. They do not prove that Tartaria was a global power, whose records were deliberately destroyed. They do not prove anything in the strict evidential sense that modern science demands, but they ask questions that the existing framework cannot answer without bending, and the framework, rigid and heavily defended, prefers not to bend. Perhaps the truth is simple. Perhaps Tartaria was exactly what the skeptics say it was, a vague European label for a poorly understood region, gradually replaced by more accurate designations as knowledge improved. Perhaps Antarctica is exactly what the treaty says it is, a natural reserve protected for science, harbouring nothing more remarkable than ice, rock, and microbial life. Perhaps the maps are coincidences, the visits are routine, the megaliths are independent inventions, and the Younger Dryas was an ordinary climate fluctuation with no connection to human civilization. Perhaps every thread traced in this long, winding journey through evidence and speculation leads, in the end, to the same conclusion. There is nothing hidden, nothing lost, nothing buried, nothing forgotten. The world is as the textbooks describe it, and the silence of the ice is the silence of emptiness, but perhaps is not the same as certainly. And the distance between those two words, the space where doubt lives, where questions breathe, where the mind refuses to close a door that has not been fully opened, is the space in which all true discovery begins. The men who built Göbekli Tepe understood something about stone and sky that their descendants forgot. The cartographers who drew impossible coastlines possessed knowledge whose origin has never been traced. The admirals who sailed south with warships and returned with silence carried something back that no debriefing has ever fully disclosed. And the ice, ancient, patient, 4 kilometers thick in places, holds its own counsel, indifferent to the arguments of the creatures who walk its surface and drill into its body and sign treaties about its future. It does not care who is right. It does not care who is wrong. It simply holds what it has always held, in the darkness beneath the weight, in the cold beneath the silence, in the deep beneath the deep, somewhere in that darkness, where no light has reached for longer than any nation has existed, there is a surface, a bedrock floor, scraped and polished by the glacier's passage, pressed beneath an ocean of frozen time. What rests upon that surface, what structures, what sediments, what traces of presence or absence, is unknown. It may be nothing, it may be everything. The ice does not say, it only holds. And the world above, the world of maps and treaties and carefully maintained timelines, continues to turn, carrying its certainties like lanterns through a darkness it has chosen not to enter. The question is not whether the lanterns are bright enough. The question is whether they are pointed in the right direction, and whether the courage to turn them, to aim them downward, through the ice, toward whatever truth lies beneath, will come in time, or whether the ice will simply continue to grow, one layer at a time, pressing the answers deeper and deeper into the dark, until even the questions are forgotten, until even the forgetting is forgotten, until all that remains is the ice itself, silent, heavy, and full of everything the world was never brave enough to find.